Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for another episode. Today we're going to be talking with somebody I'm excited to speak with, Professor William I. Robinson. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have distinguished professors, and that's what you are. You're a distinguished professor of sociology and global international studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Very beautiful out there. You did a little bit in Latin America. You also cover Iberian studies, and you're also affiliated with the Chicano and Chicano Studies Department. So very cool. You wrote Global Capitalism and the Crisis of Humanity in 2014, Transnational Conflicts, Central America, Social Change and Globalization in 2003. Is that right? You just correct
Yes,
me if these are any of these are right or wrong. Uh, a theory of global capitalism, production class, and the state in transnational world, 2004, and Latin American global capitalism, critical globalization perspective in 2008. So just a whole wheelbarrow full of books.
and
Um,
four books that came out after those.
the most recent ones. Tell the people what the most recent ones are.
Well, the last three in 2020, the global police state, and I know that that's going to be very central to the interview, to what we need to discuss today. 2022, I published a book titled "Global Capitalism Post-Pandemic," and then at that in that same year, I published another book titled "Can Global Capitalism Endure?" Um, and so all of I think those most recent books are really the most relevant to what's going on in the United States and the world in 2025.
And I guess that's the sort of that's one of my questions. And take your time with this. So, you describe a convergence between tech capital and military power. So, what you see as the most urgent threat posed by this digital military industrial complex, and how does this differ from the old school 20th century military industrial complex of the Cold War era?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And talking about these cutting edge technologies really gets us to the very core of what's going on worldwide right now. And there's really not just the two-way convergence, which is tech capital with the military industrial complex. That is happening very accelerated. But there's really a four-way convergence. In addition to those two are converging with transnational finance capital, with the giant global banks and financial institutions. And in turn, the three of them, like transnational finance capital, tech capital, and military industrial complex, are fusing with the state, especially in the United States, but actually we see this all over the world. So the old type military industrial complex you're asking about, that involved procurement. The U.S. government, for instance, has a $300 billion military budget. It orders from Lockheed Martin and Raytheon that they manufacture weapons. The U.S. government then uses those weapons to wage as wars, whatever it else it does. That's the old style military-industrial complex. Bad enough as it was, but what's taking place now is a radical transformation of all of that. First of all, leading this is the corporate privatization of wars, of systems of repression, and transnational social control, and conflicts. We're really seeing the corporatization of conflict and repression. And this is not a new story because this is part of the much more sweeping, vast privatization of the state and public areas that we've seen over the last 40 to 50 years of capitalist globalization and neoliberalism. And the global police state, which I know we'll talk about later in the interview, is an enormously profitable enterprise. So profitable, what the technical terms I use is militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression, making profit that way. And really, this militarization of all of global society, the rise of a global police state, has been rescuing global capitalism from stagnation, from crisis of stagnation. And so just to give some examples here, there are more private security police in the world, the United States and the world, than there are public police in the world in 2025. Many people, if I mention the Central Intelligence Agency or the Pentagon's intelligence agencies, you would think, oh, that's governments doing that, government spies, government covert operatives. In fact, over the last 30, 40 years, all of that has been privatized. So the CIA doesn't send out spies. It contracts private corporations to do their spying. It contracts private corporations to do the covert operations that can end in secret assassinations and so forth. The same thing with the Pentagon. And so you have this vast profitability of repression of immigrants. That's the big issue going on now. ICE has become a terrorist organization persecuting immigrants. Remember that this new budget just passed by the Trump administration involves 180 billion additional dollars for the industrial immigrant repression, immigrant deportation complex. And all of this is privatized. Many people watching this podcast will know that the Geo Group and CoreCivic are the two big corporations that run all of these private immigrant detention centers. But think about what that means. It means that these corporations, and they are marketed on Wall Street, anyone can buy stocks in those corporations. If you have stock in those corporations, you have an interest in persecuting immigrants, not because of racism, not because of anything else, but because it is unbelievably profitable. Every night an immigrant spends in one of those private detention facilities, hundreds of dollars are paid out to the corporation. But there are in fact thousands. I think the figure I had for the Biden administration, and it's now worse with Trump, is there's something like 40,000 contracts were given to several thousand private corporations during Biden's years to carry out persecute immigrants. So as you can see, all of this enormously profitable. This is something very different than the old style military Keynesianism or the old style procurement and military industrial complex. So I want to really elaborate on this first question, if you give me that opportunity, because I think it is so important. So there is a vested interest in what I refer to as the transnational capitalist class, the giant corporations and their executives that run the whole global economy. They now have a vested interest in sustaining mass wars, civil conflicts, transnational systems of surveillance and repression. Why? Because they get all the money and they accumulate capital, and that's the leading edge of the whole global economy at this point. Palantir has recently been in the news, for instance. Palantir is everywhere now. The Pentagon now has $1 trillion, an unprecedented, unheard of budget, and all of that is going to be turned over to transnational corporate capital, and especially those three-way finance, tech, and the big military companies. So the whole global economy becomes more and more dependent on this militarization, on militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression, in a double sense. One, that doing that stuff is enormously profitable. Ukraine might be a disaster for the Ukrainian people, the Russian people, the world's people, but Ukraine is a wonderful thing for this new complex at the very summit of global capitalism. In once it's profitable, but also then this repression and this warfare opens up space for corporate plunder. So you get all of this resources going to proxy forces in the Congo and Rwanda. They displace millions of people, massacre tens of thousands of people, and then open up that space through that militarized activity for the plunder of the resources in the Congo. So I think every single listener and everyone watching this podcast know that right now there's this vast worldwide restructuring and transformation underway. And it is driven by digitally, by the new digital technologies. But not just that, this transformation is controlled by a handful of giant global corporations and billionaires. The old world that we knew is disappearing. And so we're seeing not just the militarization of the whole global economy and society, but at the same time, the digitalization of the entire global and society. And so every institution in global society, whether you're in Germany, every institution in Germany, I mean, in Los Angeles, here in the United States, every social institution, every political institution, the universities, every business institution, all of society, every government is dependent on these new technologies now. They cannot function without these new technologies. And that means that the handful of giant tech corporations that manage and control these technologies and the capacity to develop and apply them become enormously powerful. They can dictate to states, to whole states. They can dictate to what's going to happen in the global economy. And you have therefore this extreme global concentration of power in a handful of these tech monopolies and these oligarchs. And to link this by way of conclusion to the issue of war that we were talking about, war is now digitalized. Repression is now digitalized. I want to, and the extent to which this is taking place, even though many people watching this podcast might know about this, they might not know to the extent of this. Here's a news article which went under the screen. No one even took notice of it. The Pentagon And this is unbelievable. I mean, it's shocking. The Pentagon has said that the chief executive officers of the leading tech corporations are now going to be military officials in the Pentagon, and they gave them the rank of military. Botsworth, his last name is Botsworth. He's the chief technology officer of Meta. He has no military experience. He's not a military guy. Suddenly, he was named a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. I mean, it blows you away. It's unbelievable. Shyam Sankar from Palantir. He's that's nothing to do with the military. He's suddenly made an official, commissioned as a lieutenant in the Army. And the reason they're doing this, here's the definition. Because the U.S. Army wants to fuse cutting edge tech expertise with military innovation. So this complete fusion of the military and military power with the tech corporations around the U.S. state. You know, it blows your mind away. Musk owns Starlink. And Starlink now is operative and gives you access to the internet. And I think it's over 100 countries right now, including Ukraine. So Ukraine, to wage its war of defense against Russia, the Ukrainian government is dependent on Musk, on a private corporation. And so Musk can say, you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to enter into negotiations, you have to open up your minerals to us, etc. That's the power of this tech capital. The genocide in Gaza is a completely digitalized genocide now. It's quote unquote by one army Israeli Defense Force officer said, this war is like playing a video game. And some of the technologies which is used for a digitalized war, because the old wars of the past are a thing of the past. Lavender, Gospel, Where's Daddy? Those three of these programs, one run by Palantir, another by Microsoft, a third by Google. And here is a military officer, general in the Israeli army. He's saying, and I'm quoting him, it's really like a data-driven mass assassination factory. So this is the new face of warfare, linked to tech, linked to finance, linked to these changes we are talking about. And you asked in your question, right, you know, what does this have to do with democracy? That at this point should be, you know, really crystal clear. That democracy is utterly being evaporated by all of this, by the unbelievable concentration of power, aggressive power in the hands of tiny minorities, complete immunity from public scrutiny and from democratic accountability. So I know that's a really long-winded response, but I think the question really merits that, you know, looking at all of these different dimensions.
And, you know, and they really did it originally too, because the limited liability that you have by having private security contractors and stuff like that. And it was always appealing. The same way they occupied Gaza and they had to get out of it so that they wouldn't be liable anymore, but they still have the blockade, which is just as bad.
Right.
It's about optics. Yeah, I don't know. We have so much going on. I don't know if we're going to make it out alive, my friend. So the next one's interesting to me, because then you see that things are bad, and then you say, and you argue that capitalism is externalizing its crisis through fascism, mass surveillance, and global repression, which it's always done. Now people are going to go back to making sneakers at gunpoint like they did, you know, back in the day. That never went away. Neo-colonialism might turn back into colonialism. So is the strategy that the West has taken on, now that they're taking this economic left turn and things are going so well, China's eating their lunch, how sustainable is this scorched earth policy where they're going to use Lockheed Martin in order to get their, you know, bring back manufacturing? What's the real sustainable, or are we watching the system cannibalize itself in real time?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Crucial question, and comes right off of the heels of what we were just discussing. When I say that, you know, the ruling groups are externalizing the crisis, I mean it in a double sense. The one hand, the ruling groups need to channel all of this mass anxiety. The vast majority of people in the United States and worldwide, they can't survive. They're seeing the social and economic situation destabilized, rising social anxiety, insecurity over the future, and so you need scapegoats. And the first way to, you know, externalize the crisis by channeling all of that mass anxiety and insecurity towards scapegoats. And here in the United States, that's immigrants. That's crystal clear. And secondly, countries, like saying China's the boogeyman. So that's one way of externalizing the crisis, and that's done among other things, through this hyper-nationalism, through this nativism, through this xenophobia, and this outright racism. And nationalism is really very rarely a good thing for the majority of working people, because it says everyone in the borders of a particular country has the same interests. So the billionaires and tech trillionaires, there's going to be trillionaires by 2030. So they have the same interests as homeless people and poor workers here in the United States. But that's one way to externalize this. Externalize the crisis. The other way, and this is the second way in which I mean that, is you shift the burden of the crisis, because global capitalism is in deep crisis and it's not sustainable. But you shift the burden of the crisis from capital and the rich to the workers and the poor. You smash what still remains of the social welfare state, and from the social welfare state, you move to a social control state, a police state. You smash the regulatory state. Trump is accelerating that. He's lifted all environmental regulations. He's freed AI development, no matter how dangerous. He's deregulated all the mechanisms for worker safety here in the United States. He's been deregulating the Federal Air Commission. It's called FAA. I forgot what it's called. And so flying is now more dangerous. He's opened up national parks to complete corporate, exploitation. So all of this is. That's the second externalizing. You externalize everything to the workers and to the environment, the costs of the crisis. So everyone knows that we have this unprecedented global inequality, that 1% of humanity controls over 50% of the world's wealth, 20% of humanity, and it's really now down to 15% in the last few years, controls 95% of the world's wealth. So 85% of the world's humanity is 5% of the world's wealth. And even on top of that, there's now massive cuts in social spending taking place here in the United States, and even more massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. Everywhere we go, there's a crisis of expanding poverty, of under and unemployment, of homelessness, of unaffordable housing, of medical coverage, an explosion here in the United States of mental health. Last year, 100,000 people died of opioids. And these are communities in the rural areas that are just abandoned by the system, by capital. So to conclude, you're asking me, is this sustainable? Absolutely not. Absolutely not sustainable. There's all of these contradictions. The first is the majority can't survive, and global rebellion is already underway. We're moving into a system of prolonged conflict, civil strife, political conflict, and rebellion everywhere. The idea that manufacturing is going to be brought back to the United States and that will resolve things here in the United States is ridiculous, because even transnational corporations only want one thing: to maximize profit. They'll go where they're going to go. They'll do what they're going to do to maximize profit. That's their strategy. And so why would they come back to the United States, even with the working class in the United States being devastated? But even if they came back with the new technologies, it would all be automated. China now has the first totally automated massive factory, Xiaomi. Many of your listeners may have heard of that. There's the biggest phone maker in the world is iPhones, then comes Samsung's, and then comes Xiaomi's smartphones. And those smartphones are marketed all over the world. So they opened up last year, or earlier this year, 2025 or late 2024, this factory, which is called Lights Out Factory, because it's making one smartphone per second, and you heard me right, per second, with 0 human beings. And so if any corporations, if any manufacturing come back to the United States, it's also going to be automated. Now, there's other contradictions. This is not sustainable. The Trump coalition is unraveling. The state, the government, the Trump government is saying to corporations, we're going to meet all of your needs, right? We're going to do everything we can for you if you come here to invest. And it's also saying to workers, we're going to improve your situation. You can't do both. And obviously, Trump represents global capital, not workers. But there's also contradictions between the Trump regime and between these governments and transnational capital. The capitalists here in the United States don't want the tariffs, believe it or not. You would think that, Trump says they're doing it for the United States. The capitalists have all come out here in the United States, have all come out against the tariffs. So there's a clash between transnational corporations and states, and particular Trump. And then finally, I conclude with this. We are facing the process of a global economic collapse. That is coming, something like 2008 or even bigger. Global markets are saturated. Global industry is underutilized. That is, there's overcapacity. global markets, because of incredible inequality, cannot absorb the output of the global economy. People, 85% of humanity, can't really consume because of unbelievable concentration of income. Increasingly, people are surplus. Surplus humanity is more and more of humanity doesn't even have jobs. You're simply surplus, unnecessary. We really need a radical redistribution of wealth downward worldwide. But all of this is unsustainable, and rebellions and instability is spreading everywhere as a result.
Yeah, and let's keep it unstable, folks. Let's get it. Let's get this boat rocking until something until something happens. Because ultimately, there will be this great power grab here very soon. As I know, people who had businesses that were valued very high before AI came along, and people who were designers and
Right.
people. This will displace everyone, and J.P. Morgan will come out and say, "No, no, no, it's fine. The guy who does the mopping and cleaning the toilets, he'll be a software engineer."
Yeah.
In this great future.
Right, and that's the thing, that the that highly skilled workers, professional workers, computer engineers, programmers, financial analysts, they thought a few years ago they were protected. Right, automation was going to affect the industrial workers. Now, the latest figure is in the last, I think the last 12, 14 months, 200,000 computer engineers have lost their jobs in Silicon Valley. So
Yeah.
AI is just as much going to make them superfluous as it's going to make a factory worker superfluous.
Yeah. Just this year, I think Google wrote at least a quarter of its code just by AI. They don't need us anymore. We are your surplus. I call us redundant. When they
Right.
talk about overpopulation, I think they're talking about us. But
Exactly.
um, so, but going back to you emphasized the super exploitation of migrant labor as a mechanism to degrade working conditions globally. How do you respond to the mainstream narratives that frame immigration enforcement as a matter of sovereignty or rather than some kind of economic strategy?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, this notion of sovereignty or national security, one, it's meaningless in the context, which I'll explain what I mean by that. Absolutely meaningless. But there's a long history of using this pretext of national security to legitimate imperialism and intervention all around the world, and to legitimate repression and inequality and so forth, and military spending rather than social spending here at home. That's always simply been a pretext, national security or national sovereignty. And of course, it's a joke because the United States is not a sovereign country just worrying about itself. It has 800 military bases in over 100 countries around the world. Transnational corporations roam around the world and don't recognize borders. So, I mean, it becomes really absolutely meaningless. And then the question is, if you're talking about national security, that's why immigrants are being persecuted. What an absurd justification is that? Impoverished farm workers picking strawberries and cabbages are a national security threat. Construction workers, taco stands. I mean, it's absolutely an absurd ideological justification for war on immigrants that has very different purposes. Anyway, what does sovereignty mean? Sovereignty means that people exercise power over their own lives. The vast majority of us, as working people, the global proletariat, the poor, we're powerless. We're losing what little power over the control of our own lives that we might have had previously. Power is concentrated increasingly in, again, what I call the transnational capitalist class, the billionaire oligarchies, the heads of the global corporations that control our very existence that we all depend on. And they're represented by, so these political and economic elites, they exercise sovereignty. Another way of saying that is they exercise domination over us. They have the decision-making power and control. So with regard specifically with this war on immigrants, I already mentioned earlier in the interview that it's enormously profitable. But is enormously profitable in two ways. This is the second way now. The first way is that you lock up immigrants, you deport them. Even the flights, that when immigrants are deported, the flight isn't a US government flight, it's contracted to a private airline. So every dimension of the war on immigrants is profitable. But the second way that immigrant labor is enormously profitable is because you're not a citizen. You don't have citizenship rights. You can't defend your labor rights. You can't vote. You don't have the same civic and political rights. You are vulnerable. You are deportable. Therefore, you can be super exploited and super controlled. So immigrant labor has always been the ideal labor force for transnational capitalist exploitation. So it's not really an economic strategy. More, we need to talk about this as relations of transnational labor exploitation and control. And it's always been very contradictory because on the one hand, the capitalists in the United States want to have their cake and exploit immigrant labor, and the government supports them in doing that. On the other hand, you have the other side of the contradiction and the persecution of immigrants. And again, immigrants are scapegoated. So unemployed or underemployed or poorer US workers, whether you're white or not white, are you're being told you have to see immigrants taking your jobs. So that's why we have this new nativism. But we have to see, I want to conclude by saying this. We have this new axis of inequality worldwide in which there's a division of the global working class into immigrant labor and citizen labor, not just here in the United States, in Europe, but elsewhere around the world as well. And the more and more people face insecurity, the more immigrants or some other group is going to be scapegoated. But finally, I want to say this. Trump was clear. He said, it's not that we don't want immigrant workers. It's that we want them to go back and then come back to the United States, quote, legally. What he means by legally is that the ruling groups have been debating for a long time a different system. The system of super exploiting immigrants has been they come across the border, you pretend you're enforcing the border, but you're not really. We all know that for the last 60 years. I've studied this. You just let them in, but then they have to be vulnerable and underground, and then you can super exploit them in the fields and the construction sites. But the new system they want is that no one can come in without a visa. And what kind of visa is used for the cheap, super exploited labor? It's known here in the United States as H-2A visas. You get the visa, you can work for one employer, for instance, an agribusiness in California. You can't leave to another employer. When you're done with your 1 or 2 year contract, you have to go back from where you come. So it's an even more exploitative and controlled system. And that is what we are moving towards here. And that's why Trump said, no, it's not that we don't want immigrant workers. We want them to come back in a different way, go home, come back in a different way. That's what he's talking about. But I would be lax if I didn't say, gosh, I suddenly forgot my train of thought. There was one concluding point on that very, very important, but I forgot it.
And yeah, I mean, the idea too is that they build up a boogeyman that they can attack, like a sacrificial thing, and then they go after it and they say, look at what a good job we did taking care of this imaginary thing that you were scared of.
Right, exactly. Yes, exactly.
Politically, this works great.
So far, but the contradictions, it's like it's unsustainable. You asked me if it's sustainable, but we're moving to a point of, explosive crisis. So it's been working great so far, but I'm not convinced it's going to continue to work great. We're moving towards a bigger crisis.
Not sustainable, but also every data that's available to us tells us that immigrants strengthen the economy of any given country.
Yes, exactly. But one other point on that, because I know your first question was on the basis of an article that my most recent article, which was titled "The Third Worldization of the Global Working Class."
Right.
And on that, I'm citing the Secretary of Agriculture, Rowlands is her name, Brooke Rowlands. And she said a couple of weeks ago, she was asked, are you going to continue to deport immigrant agricultural workers in the United States? And she said, we are going to completely continue that. And then she said, and I'm quoting her here, in my hands, the quote, and then also when you think about it, there are 34 million able-bodied adults in our Medicaid program. There's plenty of workers in America. And partly the answer to this is automation and some reform. So what is she saying? One, we're going to do more and more automation, so we don't need the immigrant workers or citizen workers. And secondly, we're going to make conditions so miserable for citizen workers that when immigrants leave, citizen workers can take these super exploited jobs. They'll have no choice. She's crystal clear on that in this speech she gave.
This is what Peter Thiel is talking about with all of his buddies behind Alex Karp. They're all talking behind, well, what are we going to do? We had Douglas Rushkoff on the show, and he talked about how they're building the bunkers, and they're asking, how do we get the security team to be, after everything has collapsed, how will they be obedient to us? Well, maybe we'll make them wear shock collars, or, and they have all these sick fantasies about how that's going to go down. Another question I have is about, the constant infighting also among the left and what's been given to us as the kind of culture war. A lot of people who are lean very far left understand this to be sort of a waste of time. So many progressives are focused on climate or race or gender or democracy, which are all valid struggles. But how do we convince fragmented movements that these fights are connected? The what do you call it? Intersectionality of it all,
Right. Yeah.
and that the
Yeah.
class solidarity, is supreme.
Exactly. Yes, this is a giant challenge. Is absolutely giant challenge, and we need to address this in order to beat back this terrible crisis with dragging all of humanity down. But I think the ruling groups definitely benefit from this fragmentation, and the ruling groups have been and will spare no effort in trying to divide and disorganize the working classes, what I call the working and popular classes, which is 90% or more of humanity. Just as you said, these sectoral struggles, these specific struggles, they are valid, they're vital, but all of them have a common denominator, which is a socio-economic system based on organizing society for maximizing private profit making of the tiny minority of capitalists and other political and social elites. So really, proletarian class consciousness and class struggle, that is struggle of all workers. And when I say workers, we're talking about in the United States, Black workers, indigenous workers, Asian workers, or light-skinned white workers, immigrant workers, citizen workers. I mean, when you think of workers, you don't just think of a male, a white male in a factory. It's all, in fact, it's even more so disproportionately people that are not white males. So proletarian class consciousness and class struggle is dangerous to the ruling class. They have to suppress it. And one of the big confusions here on the identity politics is that we're fighting against oppression. We absolutely are fighting against oppression. But oppression in itself is meaningless in terms of equality, right? Without its relationship to exploitation. Exploitation is how ruling groups control the factories, control the plantations, control the service complexes, control the financial institutions, control the means of production, control what we all depend on, and then extract profit from the labor of all of us. That transfer of wealth from the exploiters, from the exploited to the exploiters is exploitation. Okay. And then oppression are all of those things that go along with that make it possible, such as racism to divide the working class, such as the war on immigrants to confuse all workers that are citizens, such as women's oppression, which goes back, of course, thousands and thousands of years, but women's oppressions become very functional to dividing workers and to being able to super exploit through reproduction. I don't want to get too academic, women workers. But here's the thing. If we fight oppression at the level of our specific sectors, but we don't fight exploitation at the whole level of the system, we're doing very, very little. All we're saying is, oh, for instance, Blacks or Latinos face racial oppression, so they're disproportionately poor. So let's make some white people poor and some Black and Latino people more rich, and we'll balance it out. And then we don't have oppression, we have equality, but we have equality of inequality. So ultimately, really, the issue is inequality. How do we fight unbelievable social inequality? And that has to take on exploitation. It has to take on the critique of capitalism. It has to take on class struggle, proletarian class struggle. And so the big question, how can the working class come to identify itself as such? My friend, maybe you've had him on your program, my friend and colleague, sociologist, Christian Parenti, he put it like this. How do you have the working class come to identify itself as such? Well, step one, stop focusing on what minority you are a part of and start focusing on what a majority you are a part of. And the vast majority of us belong to the majority, which is workers, and we need class solidarity. So, there's a lot more to discuss here, but just some of my ideas on, responses to your question.
Not bad. And it should be said that Gloria Steinem, a big advocate for women's rights and stuff, played a big role in the feminist movement, actually worked for the CIA and went to a music festival to try to, tell people not to be communists, I guess. I have no idea. But basically
Right.
to not talk about class war, talk about your individual peccadillos. But yeah, interesting. And I think it's great that you have all of the Greek philosophers and all the philosophers throughout history has always said suffering is one of the things that you're absolutely going to do. and how nice it is for the billionaire class to deliver us that suffering. Just isn't that
Yes.
so nice? Have a real philosophical moment here. So let's wrap this up. We got a couple more questions. Let's see how fast we get. So like we said before, you wrote about the global police state and the coming third worldization.
Mhm.
What do you think is about digital resistance? What are we going to do? How deeply entrenched is capital's control, and how do we, what do we do? We got to get
Yeah.
militant. I got a militant style haircut because I thought strange times call for strange haircuts. So what should we do?
Yeah, and I'm losing all my hair here. I'm going bald. But so here's the thing. Technology is never neutral. The people think, oh, sure, there's inequality. There's those that control economic power. There's those of us that are poor. But the government is just this neutral arena. If we can just get someone good elected, everything will change. But the state is not neutral. The state is specifically a capitalist state set up to reproduce capitalism. The same thing, technology. Technology is not neutral. How it's developed and how it's applied is according to the logic of the existing social and economic system and the power relations that go together with that system. Sure, we need the internet, but remember, the internet came out of the military development because the military wanted to have a way of communicating across, within itself if there was a nuclear war. And I could go on and on. I won't. I know we don't have too much time left with the interview, but technology doesn't develop in a vacuum, but is part of the actual power relations and the particular social order. So if we want to talk about resistance, how we organize from below and change things, obviously we need these technologies, and they do play an important role in our horizontal communication. Mass mobilizations in the sense that we can communicate in new ways very quickly through text and through social media messages and, for action. But this digital mobilization can never be a substitute for direct physical contact, direct political contact out in the streets, face-to-face meetings, seeing each other and developing our social relations. The other thing, and I say this as a professor with my students, young people are dazzled by this technology. And actually this technology is important it may be for some aspects of resistance, it's also having devastating impacts on mental health, on alienation, on fragmentation of people that just exist in their digital silos, and on fragmentation of mental processes. Young people can't concentrate because of this social media addiction. So the technologies under another social order, these technologies could be an unbelievable blessing. It could get rid of drudge work, of horrible work, and everything can be automated so people don't have to do this horrible work. But in order to be able to take advantage of all these technologies, you'd have to first radically change society and its power relations, change who controls and develops and applies these technologies. And you see really how these technologies are being used in Gaza. The same technologies under a very different, just egalitarian social order, rather than giving us death, destruction, and nightmare in Gaza, can give us really what humanity needs.
Yeah, and I don't think that that's going to stop because if it's technology, the powers that be know that technology is powerful, and so they wait on they're at the beginning of the stream. Anything good that comes out goes right to the military, goes right to killing people,
Exactly.
whatever they can invent,
Exactly.
and they're bankrolled
Exactly.
by these people. I don't have a lot of hope for humanity. I don't think that we're going to figure it all out or anything, because beyond that, the ecological crises that are going on aren't going to go away with all this, and the fighting will just get worse. One of my favorite movies is Children of Men. I watch it over and over and over because this is what I'm preparing myself for. A very bizarre new paradigm where you find out what breeds of, squirrels are edible, I guess. I don't know. That being said, wonderful to have you on the program. Is there anything you want to, are you writing a new book? You got anything spicy on the horizon?
I do, but let me say, I've also Children of Men. I've also seen it several times. I'm a little more hopeful than you, and you may want to see, if you like that film, you may want to see and have other people see a film which is both a science fiction and a documentary, and it's 2073. I actually bought it on Amazon streaming so I can see it or show it anytime. 2073. That's the whole name of it.
Okay.
Watch it. But
Oh,
I
right. I have seen it. I have seen it,
yeah,
and Douglas Rushkoff is in it. And I was like, "Oh, I know that guy." Yeah,
right.
this is a pretty grim thing. It's still slightly hopeful, but
Right. It's yeah. I'm a little more hopeful, but we'll see. We'll see. Um, I do have another book coming out. This one's a little more academic. The first chapter is actually I had two more books. If viewers want to read something which is much more accessible, I have a tiny book. I get it on Amazon called War, Global Capitalism, and Resistance. It's a collection of my essays that were written more for a broader audience than an academic audience. And then I have a book coming out next month titled Epical Crisis, The Exhaustion of Global Capitalism. And I don't know if you wanted, we have a minute or so, a couple minutes to conclude talking about the potential for the global rebellion and to actually change things, or are we out of
yeah, and
time?
that no, I wanted to know your honest opinion about global change and what you think is going to take. You got answers. Tell me what do you think?
Yeah, that's why I'm hopeful because I've studied global capitalism and its crisis and what it's doing to humanity, but I also study resistance movements around the world. And if you get beyond the headlines, a lot of this is not covered in the mainstream media. There really is this every day. There's uprisings, popular uprisings of the poor and the workers all around the world. There was just in Kenya a couple weeks ago. There's now in Nigeria. There was before that in Mozambique, in Panama. There's this mass general strikes and uprisings. I mean, all around the world. There's an uprising from the barrios, the Latino barrios here in LA against ICE. So all around the world, we're seeing resistance rising incredibly. The question is, why doesn't it go anywhere? And I want to read you actually something, if I didn't misplace it. Hopeful. Again, this got very little coverage.
Please.
Cato Institute, which is a libertarian institute, right-wing libertarian institute, they did this survey in late March, so just a few months ago. And they found that, and I'm reading right from their survey, 62% of Americans age 18 to 29, I guess that would be the Z Generation Z, and say they hold a favorable view of socialism. 62%. And 34% they have to hold a favorable view of communism. So this is a generation that never lived in the Cold War like I did. Maybe you did. You look younger than me, but you got some of it. So 34% prefer communism over capitalism. So this is absolutely remarkable. It says that people are ready for a radical change away from these societies that we live in. How do we get there, and what's stopping us from getting there? Well, I want to go back to these uprisings all over the world. Earlier in July, there was a general strike in India. 250 million people. Yes, you heard it right. And this is the third general strike. 2019 had 150 million. 2020, 250 million, and now 250 million. One of the many articles summarizing it included agricultural workers and small farmers and miners, transport workers, factory workers, civil servants, informal sector workers, fishers, domestic workers, across 250 million people. And this is being repeated all over the world. You just don't see it, or you hear a quick headline and you don't realize. So why aren't we going anywhere and overthrowing this system? Well, very quickly, I know we just have a minute or so. You have this really tragic divide between the masses of the world people wanting so desperately to change things and having these local uprisings. And on the other hand, you don't have an organized left project, a viable left that can play the role of articulate all of these diverse struggles and put forward an emancipatory agenda and articulate these struggles without controlling them from above. But we do need these political radical organizations to articulate them, link them together. And we don't have that. The other thing is we need a new concept of unions. Unions is someone who has a fixed job, they can join a union. That's fantastic. Everyone that has fixed employment should be trying to unionize if you're not. But we need a different way of thinking about unions as something that organize all proletarians, even if you're an unemployed proletarian. So we need students to organize as student workers. And across the board. And then we have to think of two strategies. One is, of course, you go on strike, so you're not giving your labor to capitalists. But what happens when half the population doesn't have work?
That's
Instead
it.
of going on strike to withdraw your labor, you have to go on strike to disrupt the system. How do you metaphorically put sand in the gas tank of the system? And so I don't have the answers to all of that, but I have a whole lot of thoughts. I know we're out of time.
Well,
but
when you
that's
see one of these, when you see one of these robots from 7-Eleven going down the street, just knock it over and just leave it.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah. Will you come back and do it again?
I'd be honored. I've been honored to be in the program now, and I'm honored anytime.
All right. I like to hear that. You should come back. Definitely was enlightening and wonderful. And yeah, 250 million. It was a world record. I had to look it up. William Robinson, professor, distinguished professor of sociology down there at Santa Barbara University of California. What a cool guy. Thanks for stopping by.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care, everybody. All right.